I prefer my window. My ugly picture that my daughter painted 10 years ago, it's still there and whatever.
Yeah, my office is very messy. I just moved offices, so my office is very messy. So I thought I might try to do a background, but because my background is so messy, the digital background doesn't work very well. So we'll just deal with the mess.
If you think that your office is a mess, you have to come to mine, and you'll be so happy to see. Oh, it's so very well organized. Yes.
I did want to ask you, where should I be looking for questions, or do I need to be looking for questions?
Oh, don't worry. You have a chair, and the chair will be responsible for it. Leopoldo will do it.
Okay, so I don't have.
Otherwise, me and Ivan that just arrived.
Okay.
Hello, good morning, Carolyn.
Ivan. So I don't need Leopoldo to watch Discord or anything, or YouTube or.
Yeah, our chair is right here. It's Professor Leopoldo. Leopoldo is, yeah, he's right here.
Oi. Bom dia.
Hello. Bom dia, Carolyn.
Oh, Leopoldo, are you in the same office as Tayana? You have the same Yoda behind.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The same office. Okay, understood.
We are very into Star Wars.
And so, Leopoldo, it's your task to monitor YouTube and and Discord and the thing. Me and Ivan, we can help, but
sure,
we are here to help. But you will be the boss.
Okay, no, okay. I'm temporary. I'm just substitute boss, maybe. Carolyn, do you have any updates to your bio? I mean, if I can use the same one that's available in the website, or if you need to highlight something, or if I need to.
No, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah, just. Well, my job hasn't changed.
Okay.
So, too much.
Don't you want to add a sentence on your messy office or something like that?
No.
Just kidding.
All right, so let me just then leave YouTube open. I forgot that it's live streaming YouTube also, right?
See some familiar names.
It's actually already live streaming, right? So.
Oh yeah.
Yes, I mean in the YouTube link that it's available in the school website, and the meeting states that it's being live streamed already. So watch out. The meeting states that it's being live streamed already.
Okay, people are arriving. Just to people are here, please do like Alexandra and turn your camera on. It's much better, you know, to the speaker to know that there are real people behind the small letters or pictures. So yes, Luis, thank you. So Yes, it's very good.
Hello, Lavinia.
Nice to see you here, Carolyn.
You too. You too. Good to see you.
Also, hi, Leopoldo.
Hi, Lavinia. Good to see you. At least your thumbnail.
Yes. Today is a hard day to have the
No
camera.
problem. No problem. Coffee break aqui, né, César? Chocolatinho aqui.
Compartilhado, é o coffee break aí. Bom
Pois
dia,
é.
Mandar
gente.
pro Sedex.
Oi, Carolyn.
Hey, you made it back?
Okay, so when it's 3:45, should we start already? And do we wait for some?
As you said before, you are the boss.
Ah,
So me and Ivan here, we are here just to watch.
okay, okay. That's delegation pattern.
Ivan, he's not even talking. I don't know what's happening. I never
Yeah,
saw
he just
him.
put a paper carton on, and he's attending multiple Zoom
Or a
meetings.
video.
The entire
Yeah, yeah.
CBSoft. Ivan is always there.
Because for me, it was the very first time that I see Ivan quiet. He talks every time. He talks too much, but anyway, okay, he's quiet. Okay.
Oh, that's okay. So, all right. So it's 10:45 in Brazil, and we're about to start the second session in the Latin American School of Software Engineering. So we already had the first session with Per Lunison, very nice talk. And we are about to start the second session with a very nice talk as well, coming from Carolyn. Carolyn is a professor of information systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And she's also the director of the Center for Women in Technology, also at the university. And she has been doing research mainly on empirical software engineering and with a variety of emphasis in maintenance, organizational structure, communication, measurement, technical depth. And she has also been a highly prominent figure in this field of empirical software engineering and has collaborated a lot also with some Brazilian researchers. So if you go see her publication list, you'll see a number of familiar names probably. And she's here to talk today on a very important topic of reflecting, right? So she has not started her career a million years ago, as she mentioned, but before the year 2000, right? So nowadays, probably maybe some of you were recent born or newborn or something like that. And she has the experience to look back and to think about like what are the important things to know and she's here to share a little bit of her wisdom about how to balance things and how to keep trying to keep at least maybe all the plates, all the hats that we have to use as a researcher. And I think that's a great opportunity for you, especially those of you that are more recent in the career or starting the career, your careers. It's a very important topic to be aware of. So sometimes we are very interested in the technical part, but I'm very looking forward to what Carolyn is about to share with us, because I think that's also important for any stage of the career. So without further ado, I would give the word to you, Carolyn. So thanks for being with us in this session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leopoldo, for the introduction. Bom dia, buenos dias to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm looking forward to talking with you. My talk is a little different than Dr. Renes's talk a little bit ago. So I hope you enjoy it and I hope you learn something. So I'll just get started. Let me share my screen. There it is. All right, can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
All right, so again, I am Carolyn Seaman. I am speaking to you from Baltimore, which is in the middle eastern part of the United States, not far from Washington, DC. And the university I'm coming from is usually known as UMBC, but the longer version is University of Maryland, Baltimore County. My slides are not advanced. Oh, there we go. Boy, this is really slow. So this talk is about me and my journey and some things that I've learned from 30 years as a software engineering researcher, but also as a human being. Okay, because the two, no matter how much you try to separate them, they tend to go together. So why should you listen to me? Why are you here, and why do I think I might have something to tell you that might be interesting or useful to you? Well, as Leopoldo mentioned, I've been doing this since the last millennium, which doesn't mean I started a million years ago, but before 2000. I'm a full professor in an R1 research university. Now that's American academic terminology. A full professor, I think this has meaning in most of the countries where you come from too, but full professor is sort of the highest rank that you can be promoted to as a professor in the United States. And an R1 research university, that's the classification, the top classification for research universities. So my university is among all R1 universities in the United States. We're a little bit small. We just recently became an R1 research university. So we're supposed to say that every opportunity we get that we're now an R1 university. It's kind of a big deal. So yeah, I've published some papers. I've mentored some grad students. I've gotten some grants. I have been successful in my career. There are others that have been more successful and others that have been less successful. But I've been, I think, very thoughtful about my career, and putting these slides together has given me an opportunity to reflect, and I appreciate that. So thank you for this opportunity. So here's my story. I'm not going to start at the very beginning, but I'll start at high school or secondary school. So I went to a high school that was okay. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't spectacular. It was a public school in an urban area in the United States. And, you know, it was fine, but it wasn't one of the top schools, even in my city, much less in the US. But my high school had one really good math teacher, and he wasn't anything spectacular either. His name was Joe Smith. And if you know anything about English names, Joe Smith is the most boring English name you could possibly have. So he was just really good at teaching math, and he loved math. And so then I loved math from early on, and I still enjoy math. So I'll be presenting a series of lessons throughout this talk. So the first one is that good teachers change lives. You know, if Joe Smith had not been my math teacher in high school, I'm not sure where I would have gone or what I would have done, but probably something very different than what I'm doing now. So this is a lesson for those of you who plan on pursuing a career in academia. You may be focusing more on the research part of that job, but you will be a teacher and you will change lives, whether you try to or not, which is humbling and a little bit scary. But it does mean that you need to think about how you are changing the lives that you're touching, and to be very intentional about that and careful about that. So good teachers really do change lives. And the first one that changed my life was Joe Smith. So then came university. I went to a very, very small university in the United States. We call them colleges. So I went to a college. It was very, very small. And I studied math because, as I said before, I loved math because of my teacher, Joe Smith. But remember, this was in the last millennium, and there was this new thing called computer science. And I went to a very small college. So computer science in my college was very bare bones. We didn't have very many computer science professors. I think we had one. So the curriculum for the new computer science program was mostly math courses and a little bit of programming. So I took one programming course and I loved it. And I decided that I could study both math and computer science because there was a lot of overlap in the math classes. So in the States, we say I had a double major, which means that I studied two tracks, one in math and one in computer science. Then I decided I want to go to grad school as I was finishing up my bachelor's degree. And I decided I would study math because although my degree was also in computer science, I knew that my preparation in computer science was not very good because we had very few computer science professors, very few computer science courses. I mostly just had a background in math and programming. So in the US, if you want to go to graduate school, usually you have to take this test called the GRE, Graduate Record Exam, and it's a standardized test. And you're familiar in many of your countries, I know you have standardized tests. So the GRE is the test that you take that then graduate schools use to decide whether to accept you into their programs. So you sign up for a particular day to take the GRE test, and usually in the morning, you take the general GRE, which is about your critical thinking abilities, your vocabulary, your ability to comprehend reading, some quantitative abilities. So it's the general test. And then in the afternoon, you sign up to take a more specific subject test, subject GRE. So I signed up for the GRE in math because I thought I was going to graduate school in math. Now, the math GRE has a reputation for being very, very difficult. So I studied for months and months for this test, and I was very nervous about it because I knew it would be difficult. So I showed up to the testing center that morning to sign in to take the GRE, and they said, "Oh, we're sorry. We ran out of math GRE tests, so you can't take the math GRE today. But it says here that you're also studying computer science, and we have lots of extra computer science tests. So since you already paid for it, how about you take the computer science test?" And I freaked because I'd been preparing for the math test. I had no idea what was on the computer science test. But the end of the story is I went ahead and took the computer science test, and I did really, really well. Much to my surprise, I did really well. So I became a computer scientist. So that's the story of how I became a computer scientist rather than a mathematician, which leads us to lesson number 2, embrace the randomness of life. Sometimes things that are random are things that are meant to be, or even if they weren't meant to be, they'll lead you in a direction that works out okay in the end, even if it wasn't one that you planned. So it's probably not a good idea to practice a completely random life. But having some randomness in important points is a good thing. So I took a couple detours, but I eventually ended up working on my PhD. I worked in the lab of Victor Basili at the University of Maryland, and Victor Basili may be a name that you're familiar with. He's a very prolific and prominent software engineering researcher who did a lot of foundational work, especially in empirical software engineering. So Vic became my mentor and is still my mentor. And he had a very big lab, had lots of students and postdocs and all kinds of different people at different levels working in his lab. And I learned a lot there. Of course, I learned a lot about software engineering. I learned how to design and run empirical studies, how to interpret results, how to design research, and how to write. But I also learned about the world. Vic's lab was very international. He had a lot of visitors, professors doing sabbatical, postdocs coming through from all over the world. So my world opened up. I had traveled very little outside the United States before that. So I became exposed to the big wide world out there, which was huge for me. I also learned a lot about being human and being a person and a researcher. And Vic taught me a lot of things, and I have lots of good Vic quotes. But my favorite one that he said to me once was that in academia, none of us is making a lot of money. That you don't go into academia to make a lot of money. What we have is our reputation. That's everything. And I also learned from him what he meant by reputation. So reputation, of course, has to do with professional excellence, your ability to do good research, to train students well, to contribute to the body of knowledge. That's professional excellence. But it also has to do with your character, and in particular, how you treat others. So that was a big lesson I learned while working in Vic's lab. And so my lesson number 3 is being an excellent researcher will get you nowhere if you're a jerk. And if I couldn't figure out how to translate jerk into either Spanish or Portuguese, but if you don't know what that means, you can look it up. All right, but it has to do with being human. It has to do with how you treat other people, not only in your personal life, but in your professional life. Okay, then I started on my career, and I did the usual things that you do as an American academic. I did a postdoc. I got my first faculty position, actually my only faculty position. After 6 years, I became a tenured professor, and eventually I became a full professor. So sort of the standard milestones along the way. And along the way, of course, I mentored a lot of students and taught a lot of students. I conducted studies and I wrote a bunch of papers. I got some grants to fund my research. I did some service. And of course, I did a lot of teaching. But wait a second, what's this service thing here? Okay, so you might know what students and papers and grants and teaching are. You kind of have a sense of that, but what is this service thing? Okay, this is what they don't tell you about when you're a PhD student. So service is all this stuff over here. I don't know, can you see my cursor? I'm making a circle around party. Can you see my cursor? Okay.
Yes.
So service is a whole lot of stuff. When you become a faculty member, you have to serve on committees in your department. You have to do advising. Now, advising is different from mentoring. Mentoring is what you do with your research students, particularly your grad students. Advising is mostly about working, in my case, mostly undergraduate students and helping them choose what courses they want to take and helping them get a job after they graduate. Reviewing papers, some of you hopefully are already starting to do that. You'll be reviewing grant proposals and being on panels to review grants, all kinds of different committees. You'll write millions of recommendation letters, not only for your students, but for your colleagues as well, their administrative, the list goes on and on and on and on. So service is very varied, lots of different types of service obligations. And it's not all bad. There are definitely some positives to service work. The big one is that it does enhance your reputation. So see my previous slide about reputation. It's important. So service is how you give back to your research community, to your teaching community, to your university, to your discipline. So that enhances your reputation. It's also how you meet other people outside your own little section of your department. So it's a really important networking opportunity. It exposes you to new ideas, which is always incredibly important, especially as a researcher. And sometimes your most meaningful work comes out of service. Not always, not all service work is meaningful, but many times it is. The negatives are that it can take a lot of time. Service work can really be a black hole and a time sink. So it takes a lot of time, and sometimes it is incredibly boring. Committee meetings are not always the most exciting part of your day. So what's my advice about service? And that is to apply the Goldilocks principle. So the Goldilocks principle is not too much, not too little, but just the right amount. Okay, so that's true with service. It's easy to get sucked into a lot of service. You will be asked to do way more service than you have time for. So you have to learn. This is a good place to learn to say no. But you have to be very selective about what you say no to and what you say yes to. So too much is not good. Too little is not good either, because as a condition of your promotion, you'll be required to have a certain amount of service. Now, how much is the right amount? Depends on you, but it depends a lot on your department. So this is where the mentors that you have inside your department where you're working, where you really have to ask them, am I doing too much? Am I doing too little? Or am I doing just the right amount? Okay, so service, pay attention to service. Heads up, it's coming. Nobody told me about service before I started as a faculty member. It came as a complete surprise. So now it's not a surprise for you. All right, so a little bit of a detour now that we're talking about service. In my bio, Leopoldo did mention CWIT, the Center for Women in Technology, which we call CWIT, which is a center in my university. I was asked to become the director of CWIT in 2018, and this is a service appointment. This is a huge service appointment. It's actually 50% of my job, which has impacted, it's shrunk my teaching and my research a little bit, shrunk my teaching a lot. But this is an example of incredibly meaningful service for me, at least. So the mission of CWIT is to diversify the tech workforce. And by tech, I mean computing and engineering. And we do that two ways. One is we work with a very diverse group of students. These are undergraduate students, and we support them in making sure that they graduate and that they get jobs and are well placed in the tech industry. But at the same time, the second part, while they're here with us, is that we teach them how to make a difference. So once they are part of the workforce, they're the ones who are change agents who work on diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives in the places where they work to continue to diversify the tech workforce. So this has been some of the most meaningful work I've ever done. If I had been given the advice early on to avoid service at all costs, I never would have done this. Okay, so the Goldilocks principle again, be very, very selective about what service you take on. But if you choose well, you can do some really, really meaningful, very impactful things. Okay, so that's my lesson about service. But that brings us to the whole concept of balance. So here's the thing. When you're a PhD student, this is how you spend your time. A whole lot of time on your dissertation, that's the blue part, and you have a slice left over for the rest of life, right? But most of your life is this one big, huge thing, which is your dissertation research. Okay. If you become a postdoc, and I'm using the word postdoc in the American sense, meaning a postdoc is a research position that you take right after you finish your PhD and before you go on to be a faculty member. So when I was a postdoc, it was really nice because I was tired of my dissertation work. I'd focused on one thing for more than 5 years, and I was ready to diversify a little bit more. So I had 3, maybe 4 projects at a time to work on. So I always had something interesting to do. It was not overwhelming. I could handle 3 or 4 different things, and I had a little more time for life than I did as a PhD student. So being a postdoc was great. Then I became a faculty member, and it was very different. You don't have 3 or 4 projects. You have 6, 10, 12 projects of all different kinds, some of them research projects, some of them related to your teaching or your service. You have students, you have to write grant proposals and papers and all that kind of thing. And life, you know what, I'm not even sure which of these little slices is life in this figure here. It's in there somewhere, but less time for life. So here's the thing about managing all this and keeping balance as a faculty member is there are a couple of skills that you really need to learn. One is to give yourself permission not to get it right all the time. Okay, it's okay not to have just the right balance all the time. I don't, certainly not. We were joking earlier before the session started about how messy my office is. And yeah, I can even show you. Yeah, my office is well, you can't really see it, but anyway. My office is a mess, which is indicative of the way I balance things most of the time, and that's okay. And prioritization, a lot of people say the key to balance is prioritizing the important things, but that leaves a lot of small stuff in the dust. Okay, so prioritization is a good skill to have. But sometimes you have to look a little further down on the list to make sure things don't get lost. I do use technology. I use tools. My favorites are Google Calendar and Trello. Google Calendar to pretend that I have big, long meetings. So nobody schedules anything. So I have a couple hours to work on something. Trello is basically a list making thing, but it's a list making on steroids. And I find that very helpful. But the biggest thing, and this took me a really long time to learn how to do, is to take all the big projects and tasks that you have to do and break them down into very small chunks so they fit into all those little slices of the pie. And this is not easy to do because as a PhD student, you're used to spending your whole day thinking about your dissertation and working on your research design or analyzing your data. Well, imagine doing that, but doing it in chunks of like 15 minutes. Okay, you have 15 minutes in between meetings or in between whatever, and you want to be productive during those 15 minutes. So learning how to break things down into very small chunks is really helpful. It's also very helpful, and where you sort of first get practice doing this is when you assign tasks to your students. Hopefully when you joined a lab, when you started as a PhD student, your advisor hopefully didn't give you this whole big, huge solve this problem, or here's a whole project to work on and figure out where to start. They gave you something smaller. And figuring out those student-sized pieces of your work and assigning them to students is a good introduction to how to break all your life really down into very small chunks, and so you can get things done. So my lesson number 5 about balance is that it's a journey. It's not an achievement. It's not a goal. It's like, okay, now I've got it. I'm balanced and will be for the rest of my life. That's not how it works. So it's something you constantly work on. Some days you do it better than others, and it's okay on days when you don't achieve it very well. Okay, so the title of this talk is What I Wish I'd Known. So these are all things that I sort of learned along the way. And yes, some of them I wish I'd known a little earlier than I did. But there's one big thing that I really wish I'd known and I'd understood much, much earlier in my career. And that's what's research. Nobody actually told me what is research. I figured it out, and it took me a long time to really figure out what research is. And it may seem like an obvious question. There may be some of you in the audience think, oh, I know what research is. Yeah, this isn't for me. There might be some of you that are thinking, oh, thank God, finally somebody is going to tell me what research is because I've been afraid to ask. So this is for you. And even if you already think you know what research is, maybe this is a slightly different perspective on the nature of research. So I'll start with a little bit of a story. So I have 2 sons, and they're adults now, but when they were little and in school, at school every year, they had something called Career Day. And Career Day is when the teacher asked a few parents to come in and talk about their jobs and their professions, their careers. And there were always really interesting ones, like a chef, or there was always a fireman, who came in with all his uniform, or a policeman, or I don't know, some people who did really interesting things. So one year they asked me to come in and talk about my career. And I think my oldest son was 5 years old in kindergarten. So it was a group of 5-year-olds. I thought, oh my goodness, how am I going to explain what I do to a bunch of 5-year-olds? So I thought really hard about it. And I thought, well, I could tell them, I'm a professor, which is like a teacher. They know what a teacher is, but they already know what a teacher is. That's kind of not very exciting. So the research part, how can I explain research to a bunch of 5-year-olds? So I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm go in and I talked to them, and I said, ask them, how do you learn things? You learn things because your teacher tells you things, or you read things in a book, and all those things that you learn, you can learn them because somebody else learned them before and are able to teach them to you, or write about it, and you can read about it in a book. So those are all the things that you're learning are things that people have known before. The difference with a researcher is I get to learn things that no one has ever learned before, new things that no one has ever known before. I thought that was pretty cool, a pretty cool way of talking about research. Well, it was lost on the 5-year-olds. They had no idea what I was talking about, and they were not impressed. But I thought it was kind of cool. So I started thinking about it that way, about research as learning things that no one has ever learned before. And it turns out that is the basic definition of research, or the discovery of new knowledge is the basic definition of research. So at every stage of defining what your research will be, that's a question you need to ask every single time. What am I generating? What am I discovering that no one has known before? But this definition is not really actionable. It's like, oh, you know, how do I know what I want to discover if it's something that nobody knows? So you need a starting point, okay? And there are lots of different ways to start your research, different points of view. And you need to have a focused start, because you can't look at the whole thing all at once. So there are lots of different types of starting points. A lot of people will say that you have to start with a research question, that your research must start with a question. I would argue that. I think there are other valid starting points. So research questions are questions that you don't have an answer to, that nobody has an answer to, that you want to collect data and analyze data in order to answer. So that's a perfectly valid starting point for your research. It was how I started my research, but it's not the only way. Sometimes research starts with a problem statement. So a problem is something that's not going right or not going well, or something that people don't know a way to do, or an obstacle to doing something better. Okay, so it's not a question, but it's a problem. Sometimes research starts with an evaluation. You want to know if of two ways of doing things, which way is the better way? Or is this new way that you're looking at better than the way we did it before? So evaluation implies comparison, that you're comparing two things. And sometimes your starting point for research is really wanting to know what's the best way to do something. So that's an evaluation. Sometimes the starting point is a hypothesis, something that you think is true, but nobody's ever shown that it's true. Okay, so that might be a hypothesis. So I would argue that it really doesn't matter where you start. You could start with any of these things, all right? And my lesson then is it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you're open to ending up somewhere else, okay? So one of the things I think that paralyzes not just PhD students, but any researcher that's sort of starting something new, there's sort of paralysis when you realize how big what you're looking at is and you don't know where to start. And you want to start at the right place. And I guess my lesson here is it doesn't matter where you start, because as long as you're open to wandering around a little bit. So let me talk about that in a little more detail. So let's start with research questions. So a research question is something that nobody knows. Questions in our field, like how do software engineers decide when to stop testing? Okay, something we don't really know. Do more experienced developers write better comments? That's something I've often wondered about, but I've never done a study to ask that. But those are research questions. And typically research questions are something that you can apply empirical methods in order to answer the questions. You collect data and analyze data of some kind, qualitative or quantitative. But that's generally how you go about addressing research questions. But here's the thing, your research, there are tons of questions out there that are not worth answering. So you have to make sure that the research questions you're starting with are something that somebody wants to know, okay? That there's a reason for asking this question, or not so much a reason for asking it, but there's a reason to answer it, okay? And that's called your motivation. And probably your advisor has told you about this. You need to write up your motivation, or you need to look in the literature for motivation, or understand your motivation. So that's motivation is really why people should care about the research questions that you're asking. But here's the thing, in my experience, motivation is usually related to a problem. Usually there is a problem that somebody is having somewhere that motivates this research question, because answering the research question will help solve the problem. So research questions are not independent of problem statements. They're related to each other in several different ways. So if you have a research question and you have to ask why, you want to ask this research question, you have to come up with your motivation, you end up looking at a problem. And this might happen in a couple ways. It might be that the research question is really about finding out whether there really is a problem or not, or yeah, if the problem is there, if it really exists in reality. Sometimes you ask research questions to better understand the problem, to sort of dig down into the problem, finding out the root problem, or understanding how the problem manifests in practice. Okay, so you want to understand the problem better, so that might generate some research questions. And then to solve the problem, often in order to come up with a solution to the problem, there are certain questions you need to answer. Okay, so research questions and problem statements are very much intertwined. And no matter which side you're starting with, you need to understand the other. Okay, so say you, for example, say you start off with a problem statement. Okay, so what motivates you to do research is this problem that you've seen. And this is true, especially for PhD students who have worked in industry. You can see what the problems are, and there's a particularly wicked problem that you've seen in your work, and you really want to solve that problem. So that's your starting point, and that's great. And while you're digging into that problem, you come up with some questions, okay? You want to know if it really is a problem, or maybe it was just something you saw in your own experience. Is it really a problem across the board? You want to understand the problem better, and you want to solve the problem. And all of those things generate research questions. Okay, and you have to think about those research questions, even if your focus is really on solving it, on this arrow here, okay, that leads to a solution, from the problem to the solution. That could be the focus or your starting point for your research, in which case you do things like design science, which you just heard about from Dr. Renneson, action research, or even just a straightforward engineering approach where you build something that you think is going to solve the problem. Okay, so before you do that, you still have to maybe not answer these research questions, but understand them. And these may be questions that you may find in the literature, or answers you may find in the literature. But in order to work on a solution to the problem, you still have to look at this and understand the relevant questions. Okay, so say your solution is your starting point. Say somebody else has worked on a problem, somebody else has come up with a solution, and that solution is your starting point. You really want to work on the solution, and you might want to evaluate it. You might want to refine the solution and make it better. Or you might want to adapt that solution to another situation, another context, or another problem. So sometimes the solution itself is your starting point, and that's fine. Let's look at it in particular in the case of evaluation. Say that what you really want to do for your research is take a particular solution that somebody else has come up with, or maybe that you have in your previous work, and you want to evaluate it rigorously. Well, in order to evaluate it, you come up with things like, well, questions, right? Evaluation questions. Does it work? That's sort of probably the biggest one. When you're evaluating something, you want to know, does it work? You want to know how well it works. You want to know when it works. Under what conditions does it work? Does it work sometimes and not others? And maybe you have something to compare it to, and you want to know if it works better than something else. Okay. Well, here's the thing about evaluation questions. They look a lot like research questions. So here we are back full circle. So if you put it all together, you might start your research idea with a research question. You might start it with a problem statement, but you have to recognize that these two are related because problems motivate research questions, and research questions help solve problems. So the two are related. Another part of the landscape is the solution. So you may be working on a solution to the problem, or somebody else might be, and your contribution is understanding the problem better. So you could be focusing on any part of this. You may be focusing on evaluating that solution, in which case you have a bunch of evaluation questions, some of which may look a lot like research questions. All right, so this picture here is what I like to call my landscape of the nature of research. And really the point I'm trying to make is your focus and your starting point might be anywhere in this picture. You don't have to do everything in this picture in your work, but you do need to understand the whole picture, the whole landscape. So before I go dig into that just a little bit more, some caveats, some warnings. Beware of problem statements that are really masquerading as research questions. So research questions that are really not research questions, they're problem statements. And I'm going to get into a little bit of trouble because some of my colleagues disagree with me on this, and you will see this in the literature. Research questions that start with the words, how do we? How do we build a better testing system? How do we address the problem of whatever? So I would argue all of the how do we research questions that I've ever seen are not really research questions, they're problem statements. They really talk about a problem to be solved, not a question to be answered. And I think I see a lot of papers and dissertations that play with the words and really wrestle with the words, trying to make it a research question, trying to address it as a research question, when it's really not. It's really a problem statement. I think it's because there are some pockets of our community where the belief is that you have to start, that everything you do in your research has to be governed by a research question. And I don't think that's true. I think it's okay for some of the tasks, some of the things that you do as part of your research don't have a research question. They may have research questions before them or after them, but they may just be solving a problem, okay? And it may be an engineering task where you're building something that doesn't answer a research question, but it does, there are lots of research questions about it. So anyway, so beware. If you're tempted to write a research question that starts out with the words, how do we, step back and think maybe this isn't a research question, and that's okay. That's okay. It's okay to start with a problem statement. The other caveat is solutions masquerading as a problem. So a problem statement that says we need to apply, and here I'm not going to fall into this because I will get in trouble if I specify a hot new topic, but we need to apply this new thing that we have to this other random software engineering process that it's never been applied to. Okay. And people phrase this as a problem. It's not a problem. It's a solution. This hot new topic is a solution. And there might be some problem about this process that you think could be solved, and that's fine, but you need to state it as a solution, and you need to work backwards to figure out what the actual problem is. So I put a hammer here because we have a phrase or a dicho in English that, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay, so if your solution is a hammer, you're just looking for things to pound. Okay, so figure out what needs to be pounded first, then hit it with your hammer. All right. Hypotheses. I haven't talked about hypotheses. What if your starting point is a hypothesis? That's fine too. So from my point of view, hypotheses really are just a structured way to ask a question. Okay, and they're super useful if you have the kind of question that fits well into a hypothesis, especially if you're going to do quantitative analysis. If you're going to collect quantitative data to answer the question, then it's very helpful to structure your research question as a hypothesis, but it's not required. Okay, hypotheses are not always appropriate. So what I do with my picture here is I add a little subset here of research questions that can be stated as hypotheses. So if you have a hypothesis, that's a perfectly valid starting point for your research as well. All right, what about a research goal? I'm sure some of you have mentors who've told you, you have to state your goal. What is your research goal? And they're right, that's incredibly important. You have to have a goal. For me though, the goal comes after you've painted this whole landscape, this whole picture of your research. And the research goal is the part of the picture you're working on. Okay, the whole picture, the picture that I've been drawing for you, gives context to your work, but your focus needs to be on just one part of that picture because you can't do everything in the picture. So for example, say your starting point is a research question. That's great. You can state it as a hypothesis if you want, but you have a research question and that's your focus. You don't need to do all these other things, but you need to understand them. In particular, you need to understand what problem you're contributing to solving by asking that research question, okay? And so that's your motivation. And you need to understand how the answer that you're going to get to your research question is going to help solve that problem. And you also need to be aware of what solutions are being proposed for that problem, because your answer, your research in addressing this research question might very well say something about the evaluation of that solution. Okay, so some of your research questions might be very much related to eventually the evaluation questions for the solution to the problem that is motivating your research question. Okay, so you need to be aware of all this other stuff, but keep in mind that your focus is the research question you started with. Okay, but maybe your focus and your starting point is the problem. Okay, so then you still need to be aware of what research questions are relevant, particularly what questions have been asked in the past in the literature. that inform your problem. And maybe your job is not to solve that problem, but you need to be aware of maybe what other solutions are out there that might solve it, or that other people are proposing to solve your problem, and how those solutions are being evaluated. Maybe your focus more isn't on actually solving the problem, and maybe you're using something like action research or design science or engineering, basic engineering, to build a solution to this problem. Well, it means you really need to understand the problem really, really well. You need to understand the solution, its strengths and weaknesses, its shortcomings, and its what it does well. And related to the problem, what the relevant research questions are, particularly the ones that have been asked and answered in the literature. And you need to have an eye on how that solution will be evaluated, because that informs how you build it. Your focus might be on evaluation of the solution. Maybe you're evaluating a solution that somebody else has proposed. And then you have evaluation questions, which are related to research questions. Obviously, you have to understand the solution really well, but even more important, you have to understand the problem in order to evaluate it to see if it actually solved the problem. What else? You might be interested in this intersection between evaluation and research questions. This is a fuzzy line between the two. Evaluation questions often look a lot like research, sometimes are research questions, but sometimes there are research questions that are not evaluation questions, but that are very closely related to questions that come out of an evaluation. So if you're in this space here, then you still need to understand all the stuff that went into it. If there's an evaluation element of your research, you need to understand the solution that's being evaluated and what problem it was intended to solve, and all the research questions that are relevant. Okay, so this is the whole picture. Another common problem with PhD students early on is they do have this whole picture and they want to do all of it. You want to answer a bunch of research questions, you want to understand a problem, build a solution, evaluate it, and generate more research questions. Often that's too much. Not always. Sometimes if it's a small enough problem, you can do all of this in one dissertation. But usually it's a piece of it that you need to carve out with the help of your mentor. All right. So my lesson, whoops, it was lesson number 6. I inserted one in the middle. But this lesson said it doesn't matter where you start as long as you're open to ending up somewhere else. And it's actually that journey from where you start to where you end up, where you really begin to understand all the research questions, the problem statements, the solutions, the evaluations, and the hypotheses that might be relevant to your work. Okay. All right. Cool. So to recap what we've talked about today, we talked about me and my story and my journey and some things that I've learned along the way. And what I focused on and spent a bit of time on is defining the landscape of research, and which to me is my view of the nature of research, what it's all about, and a little bit about how to locate your research goal, your own work within that landscape. Okay, and I'm hoping that mostly we spend a good bit of time answering your questions. So we have lots of time. So what are your questions?
First off, let's thank Carolyn for a round of virtual applause. If you want to open up your microphone or just wave your hand or use the reactions applause on Zoom. And it's been a very good talk so far. And now let's continue the talk with some questions, and whoever wants to ask one, it's feel free to open the mic. I'm reading through the chat here to see if I can pick up something, but go on. If you have something, just raise your hand or open up the mic.
I have one.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay.
Do you have any advice for conducting a good survey?
So when you say survey, do you mean something written, a set of questions that you send out to a whole bunch of people and they send you the answers back? Is that
preliminary study in organization?
Okay. So yeah, the word survey means a lot of different things, but I guess I don't know. So surveys what's sometimes called a questionnaire survey, where you have a questionnaire, a set of questions, and you send that out to a bunch of people. The key part of that is to keep in mind is that the people are answering those questions when you're not there. So if they don't understand the question, or they have questions about what you're asking, they don't have anybody to ask. And so they'll they'll invent their own understanding, which means when you read their answers, you might not be quite sure exactly what question they're answering, because they might be answering a question that they misunderstood. Okay, so that means you have to, your questions need to be very, very crisp, very, very clear, and understandable to a wide variety of people. So I think the most important part of the design process for a questionnaire survey is the piloting. So never, ever, ever skip the pilot. So a pilot is when you get a group of people that you know that are as much like the people who are going to answer the survey as possible, but people that you know and are willing to spend a little extra time and have them take the survey and tell you what they understood and what they didn't understand, and ask them how they interpreted each question, and make sure they're interpreting it the way you intended. So that's my biggest piece of advice, is to do a pilot. Because if you write the questions all by yourself, obviously they're questions that you understand, but that's no guarantee that anybody else in the world will understand them. So piloting. And I think you said something about preliminary work. I don't actually think surveys are very good for preliminary work, because by definition, if you're in a sort of a preliminary stage, you don't, you haven't fully defined your research goal yet. You might not have the words quite right. So there's more of a risk that you will phrase things in an ambiguous way. And then the data that you get back from the survey will not be very reliable. So in general, the kind of survey I'm talking about, a questionnaire survey, in most cases is not the best choice, I think, for preliminary work. I would go with interviews myself. Interviews are great because you can clarify what people are saying to you right there, and they can clarify your questions. So is that what you were asking?
Thanks.
Okay, thanks for the question. I think Milene. And then I know that there are two hands raised, but we have a question from the chat from Edson. Edson sadly has no mic here today, so he's written down, and he's working with open science practices. So his question, besides thanking you for your talk, regards the slide 28, if you would have any further illustration of that slide to increase the reproducibility of research. So in the context of understanding that we as researchers also, since as students, should target reproducibility from the very beginning when stating problems, research questions, and so on. So that's his question to you.
Right. Right. So that's a really good question. Reproducibility is really important. And I think, so let me share this just so everybody can see what slide we're talking about. Okay, so it's this slide.
I think mentioned 28. Yeah.
So this is the
picture.
one with the different focuses. So the idea here is the key to reproducibility in any part of this picture is really having a deep understanding of the literature, making sure that your work can be compared to past work, so that you may not be reproducing something somebody else has done, but it's good practice to ask yourself when you're designing your study, you're designing your research, will this produce results that somebody somewhere can take my results and the results that are already in the literature and learn something new by putting them together? Okay. And I'm not talking about formal meta-analysis, but I'm talking about having results that add to the body of knowledge. instead of just being a whole point by itself. So that gives you practice in keeping in mind what has already been done. And then you can apply that later on in your research, making your results reproducible. Open science is the huge, that's the big thing, making everything you've done accessible. That's sort of the baseline. But beyond that, in the design of your research, you can describe the design in a way that references past literature, in the way that uses techniques that have been used before, or if you're doing something a little bit different, you explain it in the context of other things that have been used before in the literature. So the hardest results to reproduce are when the researcher has invented a whole new empirical method that nobody's used before. And we have to do that from time to time. We have to invent new things, but that does reduce reproducibility. So as much as you can, describe what you're doing in the same language and with reference to the same techniques that are already in the literature. So that the literature is really where all this lives, and your work has to fit in there and be accessible to people who are immersing themselves in the literature. So, does that help?
Yeah. Let us know in the chat, Edson. So we have Italo has raised his hand a while ago, and so if you can open your mic, Italo, please state your question.
Thank you. First, thanks, Carolyn, for the talk. I really like the advices that you share with us. I was wondering, like, what would you have done differently during your career, like based on your advices that you just gave to us?
Yeah. So I think one, and I've mentioned this a couple times, so it's probably obvious. One is I wish I had spent more time reading the literature, and that I'd paid more attention to the literature. So that's a clear one. I still don't spend enough time reading the literature, not as much as I should. So that's one. The other, I think, is to, what's the word I want? Give myself a break. So something we talk a lot about at CWIT is the imposter syndrome. So I don't know if you folks are familiar with that term, but the imposter syndrome is where you think that where you are, whether you're a PhD student or you're a new faculty member or you're a postdoc, you feel like an imposter. You feel like someone who doesn't really have the intelligence or the background or the skills or the talents to be there. That you've been able to fool everybody and they let you in by mistake, and that eventually they will figure it out and they will make you leave because they'll understand that you're really not as good as that they think you are. So, and this is a very common thing, particularly for women in computing, because we tend to be a minority in most places in the world, certainly in my country. So I suffered a lot from imposter syndrome and not really believing that I was cut out to do this, and I'll sort of go through the motions until they throw me out. So kind of believing in yourself and listening to people and listening to the feedback, and not just the negative stuff, but also the positive stuff, and surround yourself with people who will give you both positive and negative feedback, and believing it and giving yourself a break when it's not perfect. The whole idea of research is we're all learning things, new things. So it's never perfect. We're never going to be done. There's always more to do. So giving myself more of a break and believing in myself more and reading the literature more.
Okay, so thanks. And following, Alfredo has raised hand, and then we have some questions from the chat also.
Okay, I have a question and comment. First, thank you, Carolyn. It's really, really great to hear your everything. I really enjoyed your talk. And I'm going to, about your lessons, I really liked the embrace the randomness of life. And I would like to elaborate a little bit on it. Why? I like very much to say to my students that the opportunity is on every corner, and you just have to see the opportunity. And don't you think that we have to be sometimes proactive on the randomness of the life?
Yeah, that seems like a contradiction, right? To be proactive about randomness, but you're right. I think you're right. I think maybe what you mean is to be open to the things happening just outside your vision. Keep your head moving around, not quite so focused, so that you don't miss those random things that could change your life. That's definitely true, and it's it has to do with one of the wonderful things about being an academic is you do get to travel. We have conferences in very interesting parts of the world. Some of you were with me last week in Helsinki, and which is a place very different from where we all live, and that I would never have had the opportunity to visit if I weren't an academic. So we have sort of this built-in mechanism for broadening our horizons, broadening our perspective by traveling and by working with people from all over the world. So take advantage of that and let it stretch you a little bit. And I know that's really hard for some people. It doesn't come easy. Most of us, it doesn't always come easy because we want to stay focused. But just being open and your life can't be completely random. Your life isn't completely random or you wouldn't be here. You have to have some structure to your life. But not overdoing the structuredness and being open to randomness, being open to the things that are happening in your peripheral vision. It's important.
Well, if I'm allowed to comment on that, maybe I think the question, the lesson is also to be open to whatever we can't control, right? So we do have plans and we do have a lot of things that we try to be proactive, as you mentioned, Alfredo, but sometimes things escape in all sorts of ways. I guess that's what I take from the lesson, at least. But it's hard to learn that lesson.
It's also a little bit scary because it was only a couple years ago that I started telling that story about taking the GRE, the computer science GRE instead of the math GRE. I started telling that story and it realized how that was a very random event. I happened to get there too late to get the last math test, and how that completely changed my career. I became a computer scientist instead of a mathematician. And I thought, well, geez, that's really scary, What if it had been wrong? Well, of course, it wasn't wrong, but it also wouldn't have been wrong if I'd become a mathematician. I'd be speaking to another group of PhD students, maybe. But I guess part of the lesson, too, is it's going to be okay that there are more than one right path. And there are millions of paths. There's so many possible paths. There can't only be just one right one. So if you end up on one that you didn't expect to, that doesn't mean it's the wrong one.
Okay, so Diego Núñez Páez from Chile asks a bit of a personal question. So in your early years, why did you decide to follow the research way instead of working in industry?
That's a good one. So I didn't at first. Okay, so I kind of left out a little bit of a gap of my journey. So, after I took the computer science GRE, I did go to graduate school, but I didn't go to get a PhD. I went and got a master's. And because I wanted to work in industry. Well, no, that's not even that. I just wanted to get a job. I wanted to earn some money. So I just got a master's. I did it in a year, and then I got a job that paid really well, and it was awesome. And I moved up in the job fairly quickly. And I moved into a group in the company where I was working that was a research group. I was a really good programmer, and they needed a really good programmer. And I thought what they were doing was interesting. So I started working in this group, and it was just a very different way of looking at the world, that you wrote code to answer questions rather than writing code to do stuff. So I wrote code it was a very early, I guess now we would call it a recommender system or an expert system. We didn't even have those words back then, but I wrote in Ada, which is I don't even know if that programming language is still around, but I wrote it in Ada, a rule-based engine And I thought that was so cool. And I wrote it not because anybody was going to use it, but we were trying to figure out if such a thing would work. And so we were applying it to different problems to see how it would work. And I thought that's cool. I don't really have a customer. I don't have to worry about what the customer wants. I just have to write this thing that will help us answer questions. And I thought that was a cool idea. So then I went overseas for a while and did something completely different. And when I came back to the US, I thought, well, I'm back in the US. I don't have a job. I can start doing something completely different. And I thought, I really liked this research stuff. And I heard that that really where they do lots of research is in a university and a grad school. So maybe I'll go back and do that. So that's when I decided to get my PhD. So I took a lot of detours on that path. I didn't go straight from my undergraduate into a PhD program. And I think that was a good thing because it helped me. I'd worked in industry. I knew some of the problems there. So I had more of a problem focus to my research, which was a good thing. So that's how I decided to get into research, is because I was asked to do something in a research environment and I thought it was pretty cool.
Nice. Leonardo from Federal of Amazonas asks that you mentioned that in your talk that sometimes the researcher realizes that it's much more to the study than what he initially researched and gets kind of a paralysis or lost. Do you have any advice for the researcher that finds himself in this vast world of knowledge to get out of this research paralysis? I hope that's not your case, Leonardo.
Yeah, right. No, it's very common. First of all, know that you're not alone. It happens to everybody. And I think, the problem with Zoom is you can't tell what I'm doing, but my arms are stretched way out to my right and my left. And most PhD students start out with a research topic that is this big. Okay. In order to finish your PhD in your lifetime, it has to be this big. Okay. And the process of going from this big to this big is painful. It actually is very painful because you're interested in something this big, right? And you have to let go of some things. It is a little bit painful. What helps a little bit is keep a list of the things that you're getting rid of. And that's your to-do list for when you're a faculty member, or that's your career plan or whatever. But the point is, in order to make a contribution, you have to focus really narrow. And that's really a hard process, that narrowing down. Probably the hardest part of doing a PhD is that part where you're trying to develop your thesis proposal, your dissertation proposal, which is the point at which it has to be a reasonable size. And my advice is that you have to do it. You can't avoid doing that. Know that it will be painful and hard, but it's also the most creative part. It's once you've done that, and you have a research plan and you've designed your studies, then it's pretty much just following the steps. And not that that isn't interesting, but the really creative part where you really are allowed to come up with something new is that process of defining this narrow topic. So yes, a lot of times you will start with something and then you realize it's this big, and you start getting rid of pieces. Okay. If you work in a lab with lots of other researchers, a lot of times other people take on those pieces, which is helpful. That makes you feel better that those pieces are not being abandoned. But you've got to narrow it down. You just do. And I don't know of an easy way to do it, but it has to be done.
That's true. So I have a couple more questions. We still have some time here, but good questions coming up. So Rebecca asks, considering all the service, technical evolution, rejections, all the challenges, I think also the pie chart that you showed, that sometimes you have to squeeze in life also in the middle. So how to keep the motivation and curiosity in the academic path? That's an easy one, right?
Well, no, I don't know that it's easy. What helps me a lot is things like this, talking to students, or talking to any group of people about your work and seeing people interested in what you're doing. And it reminds you that what you're doing is interesting. It really is. Sometimes I get the chance to talk to practitioners, to people in companies, And their feedback, their affirmation is particularly important because that's who our audience is at the end. So just finding people who are also interested in what you're doing and are working on similar things or not, but think that what you're doing is cool, and letting them tell you that's really helpful. And a lot of times that's students. Finding ways to talk about your research in your class, even if the class you're teaching isn't directly related to your research, which sometimes happens, but finding ways to talk about it and get students excited about it. That's what keeps me going.
Nice. And then Luis Rodriguez from Honduras also has a problem with the microphone, and I wanted to ask two questions. One is a very pragmatic question. When would you recommend PhD students to begin looking for postdoc positions? Before 6 months before the PhD defense, right after the defense? What are universities expecting or looking for when selecting those applicants?
Yeah. So it depends a lot on what country you're in, because I think different countries have different funding models for postdocs. If you want to come to the US for a postdoc, the funding cycles are very long. So you really need to start a conversation, not so much with the university, but with a particular faculty member. I would say at least a year ahead of time, a year before you finish. Because it takes a while to get the funding, unless you find somebody who already has funding and doesn't already have somebody that they're funding. And that's unusual. So I would start the conversation at least a year ahead, and not so much on, choosing a particular university, but choose a particular mentor. That's more important. Funding is always the biggest obstacle. So depending on what country you're coming from and what country you're going to, the funding models can be very different. So you have to do a little bit of research on that.
And second question from Luis, also one of the easy quote unquote ones. It's during the PhD, how do we know if I've done enough to earn the diploma?
That's actually not a question for you. You don't need to decide that. Your mentor and your committee and your department decide that. So you need to keep asking them over and over. Is it enough? Is it enough? Is it enough? And it's hard. When I'm mentoring a PhD student, sometimes that's the hardest question they ask me. How much is enough? I usually know when it's too much, but I don't always know when it's enough. And that's why you have a committee. You don't have just a single mentor. So it's a committee decision. And it's not like once you get your PhD and become a faculty member, you're gifted with the knowledge of knowing how much is enough. It's still a hard question for us as well. So sometimes you have to advocate for yourself. The real question is, have you made a contribution? So if you, and this is good practice anyway, is to develop your argument for what your contribution is, and develop your argument that you have made a significant contribution to the literature that no one else has. If you can make that argument, build that argument yourself, then that helps your mentor and your committee make that decision.
Okay, so, and one more question from Everton Guimarães. So regarding service, in your opinion, what kind of service has a more significant impact on a tenure track career? So what would be your advice when deciding what to accept or what not to accept?
Mm-hmm. Right. So again, that depends a bit on what country you're in, and maybe even your university. But if you're in a tenure track faculty position and you're working towards tenure, well, I can tell you what it is in my university. You're expected to have some departmental service, which usually means have served on one committee per year, and it might be the same committee from year to year, but one departmental committee. So it may be several different ones over the course of the 5 or 6 years that you've worked there, and had at least 1 year in a university level committee or task force or something. So several things at your department level, at least one thing at the university level. And then professionally, you're expected to review some papers, at least a couple different conferences and a few different journals in your discipline. It's nice, it's extra if you've had an organizing position on a conference, then a program chair is pretty big, but local arrangements chair or tool track doctoral symposium organizer, whatever, some sort of role on an organizing committee for a conference. That's a nice to have. So those are the types of service I think you should focus on before tenure. Things that are not worth taking on probably is becoming maybe an editor of a journal is maybe a bit too much before tenure. Being a general chair of a conference is maybe a bit too much before tenure. What else is too much? Don't become chair of your department before tenure. Maybe that should be an obvious one. Let's see, a program director. So in my university, I think a lot of universities in the US, we have this position called program director, which is kind of like the chair of the department, except for just one program. Like we have a program director for our undergraduates and another program director for our graduate programs. So program director does a lot of similar things as a chair, and that's a big responsibility that I would say no to before tenure. Yeah. So yeah, definitely reviewing and maybe some small organizing role in a conference, and then make sure that you're doing some stuff at the department and university level within your university. That would be my rule of thumb for the US at least.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone has more questions? You can raise your hand. Otherwise, there is one comment on YouTube and something that I've also was thinking about. So sometimes it's like looking back, it's in a sense easy to say, not easy, right? But hard to do, and also maybe one comment about is that they embrace the randomness, not embracing the randomness, but also maybe tying together with what Alfredo has said about planning or being proactive. It's maybe do you have any also additional insights on how to balance this kind of seasonal rhythm as academics, right? So it's not, we are not always like on the 110% when we are close to a deadline, but how to keep up with this seasonal rhythm, I would ask about.
Sort of, I think the question is how to balance the randomness with planning and structure.
Yeah. So like I'm taking into account the seasonal. Actually, I was saying seasonal. I think doesn't make sense in English. So seasonal, like in a sense, like you have ups and downs, and you have really strong, hard weeks close to some deadlines, whatever, right? Papers, grants, or whatever. But then some weeks are more laid back, but then you do not want to be too relaxed. You always kind of fight in this, trying to calibrate your inner pressure.
Yeah. Well, I think to put it empirically, you look at your outcome variables. So one outcome variable is progress, measures of progress. Are you making progress? Are you getting stuff done? Are you publishing? Are you making progress on developing your research design? If the answer is no, then maybe you're embracing randomness a little too much. Maybe you need to be doing a little more planning. But if you're getting bored, you're having trouble with motivation, you're just not interested anymore, then maybe it's time for some randomness and some unstructured thought in your life. So look at your outcome variables and see, and you can re-engineer from those.
Nice. We have a couple more questions, if you don't mind, in the chat. So Renata asks about how to better defend the motivation of your work. So it's the case of enough to cite other studies, or do you have also recommendation on strategies to justify why we are studying what we are studying? I think that ties back to the whole feedback cycle of the problem research question or something like that.
Yeah. So there's sort of, I don't know that it's really a loop, but there is a connection. You need to start with the literature and what the literature says about what the problems are and the research gaps. But at the same time, you have to have a narrative, your own personal narrative about why this is important. And it's kind of like, it's sort of a journey. There's your own personal narrative, why you think it's important, but that narrative needs to be decorated with citations to the literature of people who agree with you at different points along the line. You know, I think point A, and these other people also talked about point A, and but nobody's talked about this part of point A. So point A is important. I think point A leads to point B. And here's some stuff from the literature that supports my view that point A leads to point B. And this is why I think point B is, you know, and et cetera. So it's an intermixture of your logic, your story of how these things fit together, supported by things from the literature. So it's really a mix, and it's not a one comes before the other. It's very iterative, back and forth, because you may come up with pieces of your story and realize you have no literature to back it up. So you need to spend some time going back to the literature, and you may find there is no support for that part of your story, in which case you might have to change your story. So it has to be a combination of your own insights and the literature. So it's not an easy thing to do. Motivation is hard to write.
That's true. And then we also have maybe a question from Suellen here, thanking you for the talk. And so I understand that our personal and academic lives require commitments and choices. All work requires choices. So what advice, or maybe additional advice, since the talk is a bit of that, would the researcher Carolyn Seaman give to the PhD student Carolyn, or for the PhD students that are here? So maybe a final take. But before I give you some time to think or reflect on that, I would ask everyone to please open the camera if you can, so we can make the photo from this room. So before we wrap up in a few moments, so we have even special guests with Carlos, Diego. All right, so who is responsible for that, Ivan or Adolfo? Okay, Ivan is taking the picture, so please let us know when we should stop smiling.
Countdown, 3, 2, 1, go. Please smile. One more time. Let's do. Yes.
I have a comment. If any of you were a little bit tired of smiling, this is a problem. You're not practicing enough. You have to smile. And you smile more, it becomes natural, okay? So smile more, and then you'll be ready for the next time that Ivan takes 2 minutes to take pictures.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah. Enjoy while you're a student and you're still like easy to smile, right? So no, that's a good motivation, right? I'm joking. But so we're about to wrap up. So as I mentioned, so maybe a final takeaway, Carolyn, from the researcher to the PhD students that we have here in the room. But once again, I would like, before finishing, to everyone give a round of applause to Carolyn, and that we also thank the sponsors and CBSoft for making this possible. And of course, Carolyn, for taking the time to be with us and sharing some of the lessons learned throughout her journey. Thank you very much. But I give you the word again to some final takeaway, maybe.
Okay, thank you. No pressure.
No pressure.
First of all, thank you all. Thank you, Alfredo and Ivan, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. Muito obrigada a todos. Muchas gracias. I've really enjoyed it. A final takeaway, remember that your job is to make the world a better place for somebody or some group of people. So make sure what you are doing is making it better for someone. So that's my final takeaway.
That's a great way to end this moment. Once again, thank you very much, Carolyn. Thanks to everyone that has been attending this session. The school continues, CBSoft continues during the whole week, but those of you that are involved with the mentoring, we have a short break now, but you will have the session for mentoring. And at 2 p.m. we have the shared keynote with the testing symposium with Mauricio Aniche on the different room. So it's not the same room. So please pay attention to that when you are joining in the rooms, right? And well, enjoy and get the most out of this school. It's a really great opportunity, as Tayana has mentioned in the beginning of her introduction to Per's talk. So we really have a privilege time here with a privilege to have lots of really great speakers. So take this opportunity and take something to you and to your research and even to your life, because some of the stuff we are talking here goes beyond the technical aspects, right? So have a good rest of the day and a good CBSoft.
Thank you all. Thank you, Caroline. I'll just share the second video. If you want to see it, it will be right now. The second video. So over here. Let me know if you are listening and seeing it. It's okay. It's rounding on top. Are you hearing? Let me.
Yes, you can hear that.
Desde pequeno, eu sou apaixonado pela tecnologia, comecei a estudar a área e sempre quis saber mais sobre como funcionava a computação.
Logo após o final da graduação, eu me interessei por essa parte da engenharia de software e decidi fazer um mestrado pelo programa de graduação da COP, né, o Palestra.
And this is a specific area in the human aspects of software engineering.
Minha relação com a engenharia de software, ela começou logo no segundo ano ali dessa graduação. Logo que eu comecei a ter contato com as primeiras disciplinas de programação, eu me apaixonei principalmente pelo desenvolvimento web.
Com isso, eu também tive interesse em pesquisar mais sobre a área e pesquisar principalmente sobre a engenharia de software aplicada na indústria, com aplicações na indústria.
Where I made interventions in online hackathons and tried to improve the experience of these participants in the actual hackathon that they could join, that is called HackGirl.
As relações ali dos desenvolvedores com a sua comunidade, com a empresa, né, com todo esse ecossistema em volta.
E ao final do mestrado decidi continuar no doutorado, no mesmo programa, tive a oportunidade de fazer cotutela com uma universidade da França e dessa vez eu mudei um pouquinho a perspectiva da pesquisa e investiguei a parte de desenvolvimento de sistemas de internet das coisas, então focando na parte do software embutido nesse tipo de sistemas e dispositivos. Então eu pude me aprofundar
ao desenvolvimento de software sustentável, principalmente na caracterização e compreensão do termo sustentabilidade na engenharia de software.
Sempre estão surgindo novas tecnologias, novas pesquisas, novos produtos, mas o importante é que a gente sempre esteja correndo atrás do conhecimento para nos aperfeiçoarmos. Com base nisso, a Escola Internacional de Engenharia de Software é uma ótima oportunidade para me auxiliar tanto como engenheiro de software como pesquisador.
Uma oportunidade de troca de saberes, de muito aprendizado para mim e não só para mim, mas para toda a minha comunidade, porque eu acho que esse conhecimento ele vai permear toda a instituição.
São investigações acadêmicas que possam contribuir, trazer contribuições importantes para a literatura e a indústria.
E me interessei ainda mais, confirmando assim meu desejo de continuar na área, pesquisando e seguir trabalhando com a engenharia do software.
I joined the first year and I'm really hopeful to see the different researchers that we have this year. Thank you so much.
É isso aí, pessoal. Nos vemos mais tarde, às 2 horas tem mais. Espero que vocês estejam curtindo. Então, é isso aí. Obrigado pela participação de todos e, principalmente, obrigado ao Leopoldo, que foi um excelente chair, e ao Ivan, que não abriu a boca. Nunca vi o menino tão quieto. Não sei o que está acontecendo. Vamos tentar um jeito no menino. Eu acho que, ó, acarajé ou vatapá no almoço para voltar mais animado, tá? Por favor.
Acarajé quente.
Isso aí, pessoal. Até mais tarde.
Valeu, pessoal. Até mais.
Até mais.
Ô, Marcelo, eu estou aqui como host. Eu te deixo como host. Como é que é o protocolo aqui? Agora